Okay, good morning, everyone. So we ended last time, we were talking about this issue of the rise of communism in China. And one thing I tried to estimate, right, we've seen so far how, like, wow, Chiang Kaishek does not like the communists, and he's willing to use a huge amount of violence to try and destroy them. And yet, they survive. And there's lots of reasons for this. One thing I mentioned earlier was that communists are really good at organization. And of course, they had support from the outside, right? The Soviet Union was helping. As we'll see, sometimes their advice is not good advice. But the fact is that also some Chinese did find the communist message to be one that they liked. Right? We have to understand, remember you read Liu Shaoqi's How to Be a Good Communist. And he promised a very nice world. Right? Communism was going to bring all these wonderful changes that would make a better place. And for people who were winning in China, people like the middle class and skilled workers, capitalists, they're doing pretty well. They're not going to be interested in communism. But we have to understand there were a lot of semi-skilled and unskilled workers who aren't doing so well. And they're going to be interested in communism. And one thing, remember, whenever I say worker, I do not mean agricultural workers. I mean factory workers. Right? So we're not talking about the peasants yet. So this would always give an opportunity for the communists to rebuild. As long as there were these economic problems, as long as there was this uneven development, there would always be people who would support the communists, right? If you're working 15, 16-hour days in unsafe working conditions, not being paid much, you're going to take a chance, right? You may take a chance to support these people. And there was an argument about strategy, though. What should we do? Remember, one thing, Karl Marx had predicted that the first revolution would happen in a place like Britain, a place that was highly industrialized. That's what Marx thought. He was wrong, right? The first place was Russia, which was only semi-industrialized. So communists were fine changing their ideas. Communism claimed to be scientific. Part of science is you reject theories that don't meet the facts. So remember, Marxism is not seen as a kind of, we can't change these things. Well, you can change them if you get more data. So should we follow this Russian strategy? Remember, the Russian strategy was you still focus on the workers, but you organize them around a vanguard communist party. And that's what some Chinese wanted to do because, hey, it had worked in Russia. Mao Zedong thought very differently. And he was very persuasive in his arguments, right? He talks about the peasants. And he uses very poetic language to say, you know what? The future is with the peasants, not with the workers. The future is with the peasants, right? Like I said, he has a very evocative, poetic way of talking about it. But one thing that makes Mao Zedong such a fascinating guy and such a good leader in a sense, later on I will criticize him just so you know I'm not a big Mao fan, but I have to, as a historian, I got to try and be fair. He used science, or at least social science, to back this up. Right? Remember, he did this survey of this county in 1930, and the county in, China could have millions of people. But he figured out, right, you had these different groups of people, and the biggest group were these poor peasants who did not have enough food and always relied on loans that they owed to these people. And he said, look, this is 70%, most Chinese live in the countryside. 70%, at least in this area, are poor. This is where the powerful class is. This is the class that will bring the revolution. And he's 100% right. But that's what Mao argued. Now, Mao, and I ended last time talking about how he favored a strategy of guerrilla war. If you're not familiar with guerrilla warfare, it's when you only fight the enemy when the enemy is weak. You don't typically wear a uniform. By day, you may just look like a peasant. At night, you go out and attack the enemy. And usually, if an army invades, you let them invade. Right? You let them invade, you let them come in to the village or the city or whatever, and then you come out and attack them later, right, as guerrillas. That will be very controversial later on, but I want to highlight what that means. Now, we ended last time talking about that there's arguments among Chinese communists. The Soviet and the Soviet-influenced Chinese want to replicate the Russian Revolution. They want to rely on urban workers. Mao Zedong wants to emphasize rural revolution. And there's going to be a struggle in a place called Jiangxi. This is a place where communists actually take over. So communists will actually take over an area within China. Right, in the early 1930s, this Jiangxi province, they're going to control a big portion of this. This shows how weak Chiang Kaishek was. Right, that a group of people who he had killed thousands of back in 1927 are able to take over basically almost a complete province. But what's striking here, and I got to tell you, I mentioned this earlier, how this is a false belief, but some people say, oh, history is easy to study because it never changes. As we gather new data, our understanding of history changes. And one thing that happened in China in the late 90s and early 2000s was the government allowed increasing access to previously classified documents. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, historians were able to do more work on Chinese history. I'll talk more about this later. But to give you an example, what I'm going to tell you about, I taught this class 3 times before this. I just now learned what I'm telling you. That's why you have to continuously learn as a teacher. It's not because I didn't learn Chinese history, it's not because I had bad Chinese teachers or because I didn't study it. It's because we didn't know. So what happens is the Chinese communists do take over Jiangxi province, but they're split into 3 factions. There's the faction of Mao, which emphasizes the power of the peasants, and he emphasizes some other things I'll talk about later. There are the Soviet-influenced Chinese communists, and then there's local communists, all of whom have different visions of what communism is and what they should do. And when I say there's conflict, I mean like they fight each other. Several thousand Chinese communists will kill each other in this struggle to figure out what kind of form of communism should they follow. So we have to stress, Chiang Kaishek's unification was very limited. Not only is there divisions within the nationalists, there's also divisions within the communists. And these divisions are so serious, and there's such a lack of legitimate institutions to deal with conflict that people fight each other. Remember I gave you that earlier long quotation about how it takes time to build up political institutions? The communists have that same problem. And when there's not institutions that we all accept, that's when we're going to have violence and fighting. And that's what's going to happen here. Mao's group wins. Mao Zedong's group wins in this struggle. Right, so I want to emphasize there's a struggle, there's a conflict, but there is a clear winner, Mao Zedong and his vision. So in the Jiangxi Soviet, Soviet means kind of government, right? They're going to establish what we call the Jiangxi Soviet. They're going to be following Mao's understanding of communism. And I'm sorry, Tim, you study about the Jiangxi Soviet, right? Like that's a big deal, right?
Yes.
What do you remember? Do you remember anything? Like what was significant about it to you?
The significant event.
Right, or what was important to you about it? Like,
It's big.
I need to stop putting you on the spot like this. I'm sorry. I need to send my questions early. I just know. I'm like Tanyu's here. I gotta ask. Did they talk about it a lot in class, or just a little bit?
Talk a lot of.
Okay. Excellent. Well, let's watch. I'm going to play a video clip that is from a PBS documentary about it. So I'd be curious to see how what you learned is maybe different or the same. But the major question I'm going to ask about this video clip is, why are these people interested in communism? Right? We have to understand that there was support for communism. If there wasn't, the communists wouldn't have been able to do anything. So why are these people supportive of communism? And what do they do once they're organized? What do they do once they're organized? Why do they support communism? What do they do when they're organized?
He believed the key to revolution lay in the countryside, where most of China's people lived. This renegade group was based in Jiangxi province. It was led by Mao Zedong. Mao came from a prosperous peasant family and was a founding member of the Communist Party. He had worked with the nationalists at the military academy in Canton, training students to organize peasants. After Chiang Kaishek's purge, Mao returned to the countryside. By 1927, he and a small group were organizing peasants in Jiangxi province. Conditions made the area a fertile ground for communist activities. In South China, there were huge gaps between rich and poor. Rents were high, and taxes were often collected decades in advance. Landlords were called the masters of the earth.
One of the 4 tyrant landlords, by the name of Joe, came to our house and saw my 15-year-old sister and took her to be his wife. He not only wanted to take my sister, he also wanted me to be his maid. I was only 7. My father refused, so he demanded 1,000 silver dollars to buy a maid instead. My father didn't know what to do. Rather than let me be a maid, my father sold me as a child bride.
People told me if I joined the revolution, I would have my freedom. I could choose who I wanted to marry. If I didn't join, I'd have to marry this man who was over 30. So I thought, if revolution could save me from this, I would join.
The communists organized peasant associations and began social reforms. Their actions unleashed pent-up hatred of local landlords, and violent class struggles soon erupted.
We smashed the landlord's opium pipes and took away his grain and clothes. He started looking for his money. The landlord wasn't home. His wife was hiding in the attic where rice straw was stored. We found her. We questioned her for several days, and then we killed her. We gave the grain to those who had nothing to eat. Some got about 50 pounds, some got 100. We gave the clothes to those who just didn't have any, so the poor were really eager to join us.
All right. So you can see some of the problems people had in the countryside. This was an area that was very impoverished where the landlords had a lot of power. So, you know, it starts off this guy singing this folk song. And what's his main complaint?
There's not enough food to eat.
Yeah, there's not enough food to eat. And we have to stress, think about this. This guy is a farmer. He spends his whole day trying to grow crops that you eat. There's something very wrong with a society in which farmers go hungry. Right? Just imagine that you spend all your day growing this rice or wheat, you don't get to eat it, or you don't get to eat very much of it. So you're going to be, and you saw how he was being, had problems with predatory loans, right? I borrow a sack of rice, I have to pay back 30. That's pretty tough, right? And that's how these people are kept down, they're kept in bondage, in a sense, to the landlords through these exorbitant interests, right? And then you have, to give you an idea, just the power these guys wielded, right? You know, he had this woman, and the landlord comes into her family's house and says, what does the landlord want with her older sister?
To be his bride.
Right, yeah, excellent. And you've done really great, Dylan. Want to get other participation. So what then happens to her? Right, what does he then want her to be? His maid, right, which is kind of the same. That was a question, right, we had in the family, right? Is Ming Feng a slave? And it's kind of like, well, sort of. And if you're a maid, you can't protect yourself, right? Whatever guys want to do with you, they can. So then the father, what was his response? What's he going to do?
Did he offer money or something?
Well, the landlord demanded money. Well, you're not going to give me your daughter as a maid? Well, you need to buy me a maid. What? Why is that my responsibility? Right, but to protect his daughter, to at least give her a better life than a maid, what's he do?
Oh, sell her as a child's bride?
Yeah, child bride. Right, at least that way she'll have a husband. Because if she's just a maid, she'll just end up being like a concubine at best. Or at worst, the men in the house will just play with her when she comes of age. Right? So that's pretty bad, right? Your choice as a father, let alone the poor girl, but your choice of father is I can either make my girl go be a bride, or I have to pay 1,000 silver dollars or whatever. Like, it's really a bad situation that they're in. Right? So you can understand why these people would be interested in anything that promises a change. Right? Anything that promises them a change. And they're willing to take a risk because things are that bad. And of course, things do change once they get organized, right? What does that one woman describe them doing?
Going to the landlord's house and
Yeah.
taking all the grain and also interrogating the wife.
Yeah, they're organized now. There's a lot more of them. So they can just break into these guys' houses, take their stuff. The government's fragmented, so it's not like government troops are going to come in and help them, right? Then they take all that stuff from the landlord and his wife and distribute it, right? People who don't have clothes, and they showed us an image of this poor old woman who didn't even have clothes to cover her nakedness, right? This is this very serious poverty. Now they got some clothes, they've got some food, and this person who's been oppressing them is gone. And of course, Max, what do they do to the landlord's wife?
They kill her.
They kill her. This is violent class conflict. Right? There's a lot of rage, there's a lot of anger here. And there's disagreements over what to do, whether this was appropriate. Remember, Chiang Kaishek wanted reform, but he didn't want this. Right? He didn't want this kind of class conflict. Mao Zedong thought this was necessary. Mao Zedong thought that this kind of class conflict was not bad. He thought it was absolutely necessary in order to build a just society along communist lines. So we only spent a few minutes on it, Tianyu. Is this similar or different from what you studied?
Yes, we focus on the little a lot of form.
Right?
In the peasant.
On the peasants? Okay, so similar in that way.
Yeah, similar.
Okay, excellent. Very good. I just was curious. Sometimes what we teach is very similar, other times not so much. So this is organized. I want to stress this. The Communist Party is organizing this. This isn't just peasants like with pitchforks and torches going around like doing this on their own. This is organized. So when they confiscate land, they're clear about who gets confiscated, right? Remember we talked about Mao Zedong, they divide people into different categories. Depending on what category you were assigned, that determines what happens to you. Right? You're assigned a category, a class category. What category you're a part of determines what happens to you. So if you're labeled a landlord or rich peasant, you're going to lose either all or some of your land. Right? That's what happens. Doesn't matter if you're nice or not. That's not important. What's important is class identity. That's what determines what happens to you. Temples also will lose land. Right? Remember, Chen Duxiu, who was a big supporter of communism, made this argument that religion, theism, is the wrong way to go. It's not modern. So religion, it's not so good. Right? Religion distracts people from their social problems and causes them to hope for a better afterlife rather than changing this world. You may have heard Marx called religion the opium of the masses. The idea is that Marx would argue that religion tricks people into accepting injustice in this world in hopes of a better afterlife. So they're not going to go kill Buddhist monks or anything like that, but they're like, well, you don't need land to support your temple because your temple's not really doing anything good, so it's gone. Poor peasants and tenant farmers will receive land. The unemployed will receive land. Oftentimes, communists will make sure that women receive land, and they can hold land in their own name. Right? So this is where you can see the kind of feminist streak. Now, who doesn't receive land? Shopkeepers and artisans. They're part of the bourgeoisie. Right? They're kind of wannabe capitalists. And there was a big argument, what do you do with these people? Because some of them are not wealthy. Some of them are quite poor. But the more radical communists like Mao said, nope, they are capitalists, they're just small capitalists. Counter-revolutionaries, if you're against the revolution, you're sure not getting land. And religious specialists, if you're a Christian priest or a Buddhist monk, you don't get any land. You're excluded. So class background is key to what happens to you. Right? Class background is key to what happens to you. Now, Chiang Kaishek is not sitting here doing nothing while this is going on. Right? Chiang Kaishek, remember, he hates communism. He wants to unify China. He can't just sit back and like lose a whole province. He's got to do something about it. Right? He's supposed to be representing the government. You know, you've got communists down here killing people, each other, and people who, you know, are Chiang's allies. Remember, Chiang tends to support the landlords, though he does want land reform. So Chiang Kai-shek is trying to do something. He actually attempts to crush the Jiangxi Soviet multiple times. He generally fails, in a large part because the troops he has aren't necessarily all that great, and also because the warlord forces are often disloyal. The warlord forces he has often are not very good. They're often disloyal. And quite frankly, a lot of the for example, the warlord forces will say, well, the communists weaken Chiang Kaishek. If we defeat the communists, that will strengthen Chiang Kaishek. So we don't want to defeat the communists. Right? Remember, a lot of the warlords aren't particularly loyal, so they see communism as an ally. They're certainly not going to risk their strength to try and destroy communism when it makes Chiang weak. So this will allow for the communists to declare the Chinese Soviet Republic in 1931 with Mao as leader. So Mao will now be in charge of a province, I think, and I want to stress, this is like a couple million people, if I remember right, in this province. This isn't some small little thing, right? And so the Soviets have developed, in a sense, their own government. And they start governing. Like they actually start governing the province, giving justice, having courts, that kind of thing. They set up like a print shop. They start trying to electrify the area, bring infrastructure and that kind of thing. And this leads to some problems. Right? This leads to some conflict. This is something we have to remember. This is why, remember I had you read Liu Shaoqi's How to Be a Good Communist, and he promises everything. If you become a communist, everything will be great. So lots of people supported them. It's easy to promise everything when you don't hold power. But when you hold power, how do you keep all these promises? It's very difficult, right? You can kind of think about this when a new American president becomes power. American president gets elected by promising all these different groups to give him stuff. But the American president can only do so much. And is under pressure from all these groups to follow through. It's the same kind of thing here. So they made all these promises, but now they actually have to govern, which means doing things like taxing people. So it's like, okay, peasants, you're free from your landlord. You don't have to pay the landlord anything, but now you got to pay us money because we need to have an army to defend ourselves from Chiang Kai-shek. So the peasants, the people, aren't always happy 100% because they've been given many promises, but when the realities of government, like collecting taxes, and the communists had good reason to collect taxes, they needed an army, the people supporting them are not necessarily happy. So eventually, Mao will be pushed out of power. Mao will be pushed out of power, in part because of these problems that I just mentioned, but also some people didn't like violent land reform. Not everyone thought killing the landlords was good. Right? Think about this, if you're a nationalist Chinese person who emphasizes, we all Chinese need to work together, you're like, I know these landlords are bad guys, but do we really need to kill them? Right? Chinese shouldn't kill Chinese. And others don't like Mao's policy of guerrilla warfare. Right? Mao follows a policy of guerrilla warfare. The problem with guerrilla warfare, I live in a village, and I would like to defend my village, but Mao Zedong says I'm supposed to leave my village and allow the nationalists to come in and take it, which could mean them destroying my property. I don't want to do that. I want to fight back. I don't want to run away. This is my village. We need to stand and fight. So Mao will be pushed from power. And this is very important if we want to understand. We'll talk more about this later, but in the West, there's often a judgment to judge Mao Zedong. And I think as a historian, I have a problem with that because we need to understand why the guy acted the way he did. And this is key. I'll come back to this shortly, but just keep this in mind. Try to withhold any judgment of the guy for now. Let's just talk about how his experience. But that's Chiang Kai-shek with some of his forces. So now the Soviet-trained communists are in power. Right? The guys who want to emphasize urban revolution and all that stuff. Those guys are now in charge because Mao has been pushed out. In 1934, Chiang Kai-shek will launch his fifth encirclement campaign, his fifth attempt to defeat the communists. So he's actually going to try and encircle, to surround the communists here. That's his goal. Right? He's going to surround them and then just slowly tighten things up so he can crush them. Right? You surround them and then get closer and closer and closer until you destroy them. That's his goal. And before, remember how I emphasized he had bad soldiers? Now he has all these German-trained troops. Remember I showed you the picture of the woman with the German helmet? Now he's got these elite German-trained troops. They have machine guns, and they have the strategy of building like houses made of concrete, block houses, and using barbed wire to try and make so the communists can't escape. They can just slowly tighten that noose and destroy the communists.
So that's because of his alliance with Germany, right?
I don't think it's quite an alliance, but they do make a deal. Like he gives the Germans like important minerals, and they give him military aid. But you're right, yeah, it's in part. This is large part because of German support. Remember, Mao Zedong is not here, or he's not the leader anymore. The new communist strategy says no more guerrilla tactics. We're just going to stand up and fight Chiang Kai-shek directly. This failed miserably. Mao Zedong was right. You maybe don't like leaving your village and letting the nationalists take it, But if you try and stand there and fight them, they're going to kill you and take your village anyway. So better that you leave, fight a guerrilla war, and force them out that way. So I want to stress, the new communist strategy led by the Soviet-trained communists in which they tried to fight back directly without guerrilla warfare failed. It failed. However, fortunately for the communists, they were able to break out, right? Chiang Kai-shek's goal was to tighten this up so much that he could destroy them. A group broke out. They basically, what happened was, they did find an area that the warlord troops were in charge of, and they bribed them so they could leave. There was a lot of corruption. This is Chiang Kai-shek's problem, right? He can never completely unify his government. And with the help of some, it's not simply the communists didn't fight, they did fight, but the warlord troops don't try and fight them very hard, they let them go. Like I said, the warlords are quite happy if Chiang Kai-shek doesn't defeat the communists, because that means Chiang Kai-shek is weaker, he can't use those forces against them. But what's key then is the communists will go on to lose several battles with the nationalists. They're not destroyed, but they lose several battles. And the failure is attributed to the Moscow-oriented Chinese communists. Right? Remember, Mao's pushed from power. And then they try this other strategy, and it fails miserably. They lose control of the Jiangxi province. They lose control of this area they had governed. A bunch of them die, and they lose all these battles. So people say, Mao was right. We need to follow this guy again. And so Mao will return to power. And under Mao's leadership, they'll engage in what's called the Long March. They'll go all the way from Jiangxi province and march all the way up here north. Like, this is people walking through mountains. A lot of them die. A lot of people run away. But they talk a lot about this, right, in Chinese history. Right? The Long March is very, very, very famous. But the key thing is the communists will survive. Right? Under Mao's leadership, right, he's able to keep the movement together. And despite these terrible reverses, they're able to survive. Now, like I say, part of it's because he was a good leader. Another part of it was, like I said, the warlord forces don't care. The warlord forces are fine if the communists survive because they weaken Chiang Kai-shek. But if we want to understand Mao, like I said, in the West, there's this rush to judgment of Mao. Personally, I've got a lot of criticism I would say about him, but as a historian, I have to emphasize we need to understand why he acted the way he did. And here's what Mao learns, I think, from this experience. You have to have unity, right? What caused these problems was division among the communists. Communists disagreed about what to do. If they would have stayed unified, they would have followed Mao, things would have been all right, because Mao had the right strategy. And I and Mao Zedong am usually right. Notice, he was right multiple times here when other people were wrong. So this convinces Mao, first of all, we have to have unity, and second of all, that unity needs to be under me, because I know what I'm doing. And he does. So we communists need to be unified. We need to know what we're doing. And look at those nationalists. They're divided. That's why we're able to survive. And we need to exploit those divisions. So this is going to really shape Mao. I think it gives him a lot of confidence. I know what I'm doing. And when I do things, they go right. So we'll continue with section 8 momentarily. Do remember short paper 2 is due by 11:59 p.m. tonight. Review quiz 9 will be due by this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. So keep that in mind. Reading quiz 8 will be delayed a week. It will now be due by Sunday, November 3rd. Right? So we normally, if you look at the schedule, it says reading quiz due this weekend. No, it's not. We're delaying it because we're not quite as far along as I want to be. So any questions there about upcoming events? Okay, just an aside, sometimes people send me emails about their papers, like in the evening. I stop checking email about 8 p.m. Right? So if you have a question about the paper or something like that, you need to email it to me before then. Okay, so that brings us then to section 8. I got new recording software, so yep, still recording. So hopefully that will work. So moving on then to section 8, where we talk about poor China's wars. And I think this section in particular helps us to really understand, I think, a Chinese perspective today. So our objectives here, we're going to look at the history of China from 1937 to 1953, which in many ways is a series of wars. Japan will invade in 1937. That invasion, which starts off as like a regional war, will help turn into World War II for China in 1941. There'll be a short, and that will last to 1945. There will be a short break in the Civil War because of American mediation efforts, which will fail, leading for the Chinese Civil War between communist and nationalists to break out again from 1945 to 49. Then they'll have a few months break, and then it'll be time for the Korean War. So that's what I mean. Things are getting worse in a sense instead of better. More and more Chinese people will be dying because of the division and instability of China. So when we going back to Tianyu and thinking of how he was proud of the National Day celebration with this show of Chinese strength, this is one reason why. Because Chinese military weakness leads to a bunch of Chinese dying, bluntly put. We will also try to understand the course of the Second World War from the Chinese perspective. Most of you are Americans, are used to thinking of this from the American perspective. We'll try to understand also why the communists won the Chinese Civil War. Right? Like I say, in 1934, 35, things do not look good for the communists. And yet somehow they managed to become the dominant force in China. We'll try to understand why. So in a sense, as reviewed, Chiang was on the way to building a modern state, but he had two problems: the communists and Japan. And what's ironic, because Japan will invade China in part to try and defeat communism, their invasion of China will allow the victory of the communists, because it will weaken Chiang Kaishek. So it's a very curious thing. But these are Chiang Kai-shek's two major problems, the communists and Japan. Before we talk, though, about the invasion of Japan, we need to talk about a place called Manchuria. Right? We need to talk about a place called Manchuria. Right? That's the land of the Manchus. That's where the Manchus came from. By this time, the majority of people, though, who live here are actually Han Chinese. There's large numbers of Koreans, though, as well, because Manchuria borders with Korea. This area called Jindao has a very large number of Koreans. Now, I have to stress, Manchuria is a huge place. The geographical scope of Manchuria, it's larger than France, Germany, and Austria combined. So this is a huge amount of territory, right? I want to stress that. It's easy to think, oh, it's just one province. Why is it such a big deal? We're talking about a lot of territory here. This place is huge. It was also rich in natural resources. In the 1930s, Manchuria accounted for 90% of China's oil, 70% of its iron, 55% of its gold, and 33% of its trade. So this is in many ways such an important area to China. Not only is it big, it is economically one of the important powerhouses of China. We can't overemphasize this enough. It produced almost 60% of the world's soybeans. Not Chinese soybeans, I'm saying world soybeans. Right? And if you tofu and other things like that, mainstays of the East Asian diet are made of soybeans, soya. And of course you can make plastics and other things out of soybean products. So this place is really, really important. And it's also the industrial center of China. There's huge amounts of factories here. But it's complex. This is Chinese territory, but Japan controlled what was called the Southern Manchuria Railway there, so they controlled a lot of the infrastructure. And what's key is when you control a railway, you control trade to a large extent because you set the rates of railway travel, how much it costs to ship things. You also, there's territory around the railway, what's called right-of-way, so you control not only the rail line, but a couple miles outside the rail line. And the Japanese said, well, the Chinese are doing such a bad job defending this area, we need to have the right to have troops here. So the Japanese stationed something called the Kwantung Army in Manchuria to protect it. So this is a big deal. This is very important to China, but wow, isn't this a tempting prize for Japan? So by 1931, we need to now talk, this is Japan's relationship to Manchuria. Japan accounted for 72% of foreign investments in Manchuria. Right? That's one reason why Manchuria was so developed, was because the Japanese invested a lot of money in it. 40% of Japan's trade with China went through Manchuria. 1 million Japanese lived in Manchuria. Whoa, that's a lot of people. Especially, I think the Japanese population this time was about 60 or 70 million. That's a lot of people living outside of Japan in one province. Now, obviously, this is a concern for the Chinese. The Chinese warlord, a man named Zhang Zhuolin, will try to prevent increasing Japanese influence because he realizes, the Japanese are becoming more and more powerful here. They have the right to have an army here. They're so powerful. I need to do my best to prevent that. So he will take efforts to kind of block Japanese trade, to limit their influence. Japanese military officers respond to this by blowing up his train while he's on it. Right? So he's assassinated by the Japanese military. Right? And this is not something that is coming from Tokyo. These are Japanese rogue military officers acting on their own. Right? This is not something coming from Tokyo. And his son, Zhuang Zheliang, who we'll talk more about later, will come to power. And remember, this guy, he's technically part of the nationalist government, But he's allowed to run Manchuria the way he wants to run it, for the most part. Chiang Kaishek can't really tell him what to do. He's got his own army. He follows his own kind of policy. But he's now in charge. And he's willing to work with the Japanese somewhat, but he hates them because he killed his dad. Right? Remember, you can't sleep under the same sky as the man who killed your father. So he wants revenge. He hates the Japanese. He wants revenge against them if he ever gets the opportunity. I said you can't sleep under the same sky as the man who killed your father, but the Chinese also have a saying, was it to drink gall and sleep on thorns, I think is the saying. And it means to suffer patiently until you have the chance to get revenge. I misquoted it, Tian Yu. I need to look it up, sorry. So drink gall and sleep on thorns, I think. Chinese are really good at these sayings. I love them. So what makes things even more serious, right? Japan, I mean, just looking at this, you can see how there's already, Japan has a serious economic and political interest in China, or in Manchuria. In addition, remember, in 1929, you have the Depression, right? The Depression will hit, and this will lead to the decline of international trade. Right? This is going to lead to the decline of international trade. That hurts Japan. Japan does not have food security. China, United States, I mean, it would be terrible if we couldn't trade with the outside world. That would limit our wealth, but we would not starve. But if Japan at this time period could not trade with the outside world, it would literally starve. The Japanese did not have food security. So when the Depression hits, and there's a decline in international trade, that freaks out the Japanese. Not only do they rely on the outside world for food, they also rely on the outside world, particularly the United States, for oil. So Japan is dependent on international trade to survive. That international trade in the wake of the Depression is drying up. In addition, Japan is afraid of the Soviet Union. Right? The Soviet Union is becoming stronger. Under Joseph Stalin, its crash industrialization is working quite well. And Japan is also worried about the Western empires who refuse to take it seriously and treat Japan as kind of a second-class citizen. So this will lead many Japanese, especially in the military, to support ideas of Pan-Asianism. It says we Asians need to stick together to fight the Soviet Union and the West. Right? Asia for the Asians. And sometimes they go back to those social Darwinistic people. You're yellow, I'm yellow, you have black hair, I have black hair, we need to stick together. And they use those terms, right? That's how they talked about it in this time period. Now there's kind of a tension here because the Japanese government, and especially the military, would say Asia for the Asians, but the idea was that they would unite Asians under Japanese leadership. So for many Asian people, this seemed just like a new kind of imperialism. But from the Japanese perspective, their argument was, we were the first Asian nation to modernize successfully, therefore it's up to us to unify Asia in order to protect it from the Western empires and from communism and the Soviet Union. And look at what a rotten job Chiang Kaishek is doing against the communists. Now, I should also point out, though, that the Japanese wanted to weaken China because it would be easier to get resources from China if China was weak. So there's a tension here. But these, and I just found these things are amazing. These are Japanese postcards from Manchuria. Notice you've got the Japanese soldier there, and he's got a little Japanese kid on his back waving a Japanese flag. There you can see a little Chinese boy. You can tell by the clothes he's wearing. And oh, do you see the flag they're waving? Remember that flag? The Five-Nation flag that the nationalists had used early. Right? Remember the colors? The red is the Han, the yellow is the Tibet. Oh, darn it. Blue, I think, is the Mongols. White are the, oh goodness, I forget. I think are the Manchus are yellow, that's right. And then the black are the Muslims. Right? So Japan is trying to draw on this idea, let's unify Asian people together against the West. And you can see it being celebrated here, but notice this, you can see the tension here, adult, kids. Right? We Japanese were the adults, we're mature, we're modern. You Chinese, Manchurian, other kids, you need to get your act together. We're the ones that can help you do that. But you have to do what we say. So from the Japanese perspective, right, they need resources and an empire to maintain their own security, but they see that as tied to all of Asia. Right? They want to unite all of Asia under them to protect it from the West, from the Soviet Union. To do that, they need resources. Who's the logical place to get it from? China. Right? China is the logical place to get resources from. It's right next to Japan. Japan has the colony of Korea right here. So it makes sense to try and get those resources from China. If you're just thinking of purely strategically. It wants them from China, but cannot obtain them from a strong, unified China. So the Japanese hate Chiang Kaishek. Logically speaking, right, if Japan's major concern was communism, they should have helped Chiang Kai-shek defeat the communists. But Japan also wants a weak China. They don't want a unified China under Chiang Kai-shek because that China can control its own resources. So Japan has a fundamentally hostile, in a sense, what can I say? Japan's situation and its issues it faces helps lead some Japanese people to take a hostile view of China. So in the name of rescuing China, they become convinced that China has a terrible government that they need to replace and fix. So there's this weird tension. The Chinese are kind of inferior, they're having problems, so we need to help them, and we're going to do that by invading them to fix their problems. So we're going to invade them to help them. You can see there's some problems with that idea, but that's what a lot of Japanese are thinking. So there's this inability to take the Chinese seriously or to understand the changing situation in China. Japan is thinking back to its easy victories over China in 1894 and 95, when the Japanese just defeated the Chinese no problem. It's a new China. It's a different China. And Japan, the Japanese don't seem to understand that this is a new China. They're not just going to give up. Remember the old China, you lose a couple cities, you give up, you come to terms. This is a completely different China. And so the Japanese inability to take the Chinese seriously or understand the changing situation in China prevents them from working with the Chinese as equal allies. If the Japanese were so concerned about communism and Western imperialism, it would have made sense to work with the Chinese, to work with Chiang Kai-shek. They don't do that. One of the major reasons they don't do this, I've been saying the Japanese, I need to now qualify that statement. It was mostly the military. Japan underwent, basically the military will become more and more in power. Civilians who try and control the military will often be assassinated. We'll talk much about in this class. If you took my Modern Japan class or Modern East Asia class, we'll talk about this a lot. So increasingly Japan will be controlled by soldiers. Now what's problematic about this is because these soldiers aren't really good at fighting wars. That may sound bizarre, but the soldiers who take charge of Japan in this time period are really bad soldiers in many ways. They don't really understand modern warfare. They understand small unit tactics. They understand, using rifles and bayonet charges and things like that, but they don't understand modern warfare. So basically, these new military men who take power in Japan believe that spirit can make up for all military inadequacies. So they say, oh, we don't have enough tanks, we don't have enough airplanes, we don't have enough oil. It doesn't matter, the superior Japanese spirit will win. And when their soldiers get killed because they don't have tanks, they blame the soldiers, say, oh, the soldiers were not spirited enough, it's the soldiers' fault. It's not their fault, you didn't give them good weapons against tanks, and the enemy had tanks. But you basically had this rise of military men who think that whatever happens, the superior Japanese spirit can win. And that's why they're willing to do this crazy thing. Just to give you an example, if you took my Modern Japan class, you may remember this moment. I played a clip from a meeting in 1945 that the high Japanese officials met to discuss, and it's 1945, the Americans are coming to invade Japan. And I'm not kidding, the army minister said, he was criticized by another minister who said, the Americans have unlimited resources, we're almost out. And I'm not kidding, the military minister, war minister says, the only thing unlimited is the soaring of the spirit. Meaning it doesn't matter if we don't have bombs or tanks or weapons, we can defeat the Americans because we have better spirits. So you have these complete numbskulls in charge. So to give you an idea of their numbskullery, I don't know if that's a word, but it is now.
I believe I've heard that before.
Okay, excellent. I think it's from The Simpsons. It's a perfectly cromulent word. So they had a brilliant plan. This is their brilliant plan. A group of Japanese army officers in 1931, they want to take over Manchuria. So what they do is they set up a bomb on the southern Manchuria Railway. You can see the vast amount of damage done by the bomb. I mean, isn't it obvious how serious damage this did? I'm being sarcastic. It hardly hurt the railway at all. But what they did is they said, they set the bomb, they do it secretly, they say, oh, Chinese bandits set the bomb, therefore we have to take over all of Manchuria. Because they blew up a little piece of railway. And that's what they did. Right? So you had this group of army officers, Japanese army officers, not acting on orders from Tokyo. Their highest ranking officer who did this was a colonel, not even a general. Right? He is going to organize this destruction of this, and the Japanese will use this as a justification. Dr. Hess, you're okay if you need to go ahead. Oh, Dr. Hess, did you need to go for your meeting? Oh, you can go ahead, sir. The Japanese, like I said, officers will blow this up and then take over everything. So the Japanese army now rush in to seize Manchuria. So you can already see that this is really, really a weird situation, right? You've got these guys who blow up a little bit of a railway and then take over something the size of Austria, France, and Germany combined. Yes, Cameron?
Was the rest of the world like openly suspicious of their crime?
Oh yeah. I'm glad you're thinking like a historian, Cameron. That was my next slide.
Okay.
So what happens is, you may have heard of the League of Nations. It was basically like a slightly weaker version of I shouldn't say slightly, very weak version of the United Nations. They had something called the League of Nations. China protested this. China could not fight back. The Chinese army was not good enough to fight back in this time period. Chiang Kaishek, it was difficult to move his army. Remember, his power base is in the south. Very hard for him to get up here. So Chiang Kaishek will bring this to the League of Nations to protest. This actually image back here, this is of League of Nations investigators who've come out to look at this, to inspect the damage, and to see what merit the Japanese claims had. And they said, these have no merit. Japan should withdraw from Manchuria, and so Japan responded by withdrawing from the League of Nations. So this is when Japan is kind of becoming a rogue nation. Right? They're rejecting the West, saying we don't want to have anything to do with these Westerners. They don't understand our situation. We're going to turn away from them. This leads to the establishment of what's called Manchukuo. So what's tricky here is the Japanese can't just say, this is now Japan. This had been recognized in a sense as Chinese territory by many treaties. So instead what Japan's argued was, this is Manchuria, it should be ruled by the Manchus. Right? Makes sense, right? China should be ruled by the Chinese, Japan should be ruled by the Japanese, Manchuria should be ruled by the Manchus. So they establish a government called Manchukuo. Kuo just means country. Right? That's the Japanese pronunciation of guo, or guk. Koreans pronounce it guk, Japanese guo. I'm sorry, guk. Can you say it, please? Well, yeah, that's how Chinese say it. The Japanese say kuo. And this is going to be a puppet government led by Puyi, the last Manchu emperor. Right? He's going to be in charge of this new puppet government. We'll pick up with that puppet government on Wednesday. I'll see you all then. We'll continue fighting World War II in China.